The hedgerows outside Sainte-Mère-Église stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness of June 8, 1944. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann of the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division pressed himself against the earth-packed wall of bramble and root, his carabiner 98K rifle slick with morning dew. For 2 days since the invasion, he had watched American paratroopers move through these Norman fields with an intensity that defied everything his officers had told him about the enemy. These were not the soft, inexperienced troops Berlin had promised. These men fought like they had been born in these hedgerows. 3 meters to his left, his squad leader Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker whispered a single word that would haunt Hartmann for the rest of his life. Teufel. Devils. The Americans who had dropped from the night sky on the 6th of June were supposed to be scattered, disorganized, easy prey for the Wehrmacht's defensive positions. Instead, they had seized the town behind him, held a critical causeway against repeated counterattacks, and now hunted German positions with a methodical ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. Their jumpsuits, loose, baggy, unlike anything Hartmann had seen on a soldier, gave them a strange silhouette in the broken light filtering through the hedgerow canopy. But it was not their appearance that earned them their nickname. It was what they did when the shooting started. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how German commanders came to call the 82nd Airborne Division Devils in Baggy Pants is not simply a tale of battlefield nicknames or propaganda. It is a story about the collision between expectation and reality, between what the Wehrmacht believed about American fighting quality and what they discovered in the blood-soaked hedgerows of Normandy. To understand why hardened German veterans, men who had fought across Poland, France, and Russia, would grant such a distinction to an American unit, we must first understand what they expected to face and what the 82nd Airborne had become by the time they jumped into occupied France. In the spring of 1944, German military intelligence maintained a distinctly condescending view of American ground forces. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht command structures suggested that while American industrial capacity was formidable, their soldiers lacked the hardness, the tactical sophistication, and the battlefield cunning of German troops. This assessment was not entirely without foundation. American forces in North Africa had stumbled badly in their first encounters with German armor at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943. The image of Americans as wealthy, soft, dependent on overwhelming material superiority rather than warrior spirit, this narrative found fertile ground in German military culture. Airborne forces occupied a particular place in German military thinking. The Luftwaffe's own Fallschirmjäger, paratrooper forces, had achieved legendary status through their operations in the Low Countries and their costly but ultimately successful assault on Crete in May of 1941. The capture of Crete had cost the Fallschirmjäger nearly 4,000 casualties, losses so severe that Hitler never again authorized a major airborne assault. But the reputation remained. Paratroopers were elite, highly trained, capable of extraordinary violence when properly employed. The question was whether Americans could produce such men. German intelligence officers, analyzing the Allied buildup in England before D-Day, knew the Americans were training airborne divisions. The 82nd, designated as an airborne division in 1942, had already seen combat in Sicily and Italy. Reports from those theaters suggested competence, but nothing exceptional. The division had seized objectives, held ground, performed adequately. But the Mediterranean was not France, and adequate was not the same as formidable. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the transformation the 82nd Airborne had undergone between its activation in March of 1942 and its preparation for Normandy. The division's commander, Major General Matthew Ridgway, had built his unit around a philosophy of aggressive leadership and relentless training. Ridgway believed that airborne soldiers, by the nature of their insertion method, would always be outnumbered, always be surrounded, always be fighting at a disadvantage. The only way to survive was to attack, always attack. Seize the initiative, hold it, never give the enemy time to organize or think or respond. The training regime Ridgway imposed was brutal, even by the standards of 1940s military preparation. Paratroopers in the 82nd conducted practice jumps in all weather conditions, day and night. They trained in small unit tactics, learning to operate independently when, not if, they became separated from their parent units. They learned to navigate by stars and terrain features, to fight with whatever weapons they could scrounge, to improvise explosives and obstacles from battlefield salvage. Most critically, they trained to be aggressive. When you hit the ground, you attack toward the sound of guns. When you encounter the enemy, you assault through the position. When you face a superior force, you maneuver and hit them from an unexpected angle. This was not typical infantry doctrine for 1944. Standard practice for most units was to establish defensive positions when encountering superior forces, to wait for support, to call for artillery or armor. Airborne soldiers could not wait. They had no artillery to call on, not until it could be brought forward, which might take hours or days. They had no armor except what they could capture. They had only what they carried in their packs and on their bodies, and they had the training Ridgway had hammered into them. Attack, attack, attack. The men who filled the ranks of the 82nd by June of 1944 came from across the American spectrum. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from New England, cowboys from Montana. Volunteers, all airborne service was entirely voluntary, with extra pay of $50 per month for jump status. But the money was not why most of them signed up. They joined because airborne units represented something elite, something special. They joined because the standards were higher, the training harder, the reputation more prestigious. They joined because they wanted to be among the best. By the time the division prepared for Normandy, its soldiers had developed a distinct identity. They wore the M1942 jumpsuit, a loose-fitting, baggy, one-piece garment with reinforced knees and elbows, designed to be worn over regular uniforms and to accommodate the parachute harness. The suits had large pockets for ammunition, grenades, first aid supplies, rations. They made the paratroopers look bulky, almost ungainly on the ground, but they were practical for the mission. Under the jumpsuits, the men wore standard olive drab wool uniforms. On their heads, the M1C parachutist helmet, a modified version of the standard M1 helmet with a different liner and chin cup to prevent it from being torn off during the opening shock of the parachute deployment. Each man carried an astonishing amount of equipment for the Normandy jump. The basic load included the M1 Garand rifle or M1 carbine, between 100 and 200 rounds of ammunition, multiple hand grenades, a knife, first aid kit, 2 days of rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, and whatever specialized equipment his role required. Demolitions for engineers, medical supplies for medics, radios for communication specialists. The total weight often exceeded 100 pounds. Combined with the main parachute and reserve chute, some paratroopers jumped carrying more than 130 pounds of gear. This was the force that German intelligence officers assessed in the weeks before D-Day. On paper, they saw an American division with approximately 13,000 men, organized into 3 parachute infantry regiments, the 504th, 505th, and 508th, plus supporting artillery, engineers, and service units. They saw standard American equipment, generous supplies, reasonable training. What they did not see, because it could not be captured in intelligence reports, was the psychological preparation, the aggressive mindset, the absolute conviction that Ridgway had instilled in his men. You are the best. You will attack. You will win. The German forces defending Normandy in June of 1944 were a mixed lot. The best divisions, the Panzer and Panzergrenadier units, were held in reserve, waiting for the main invasion that German High Command believed would come at the Pas de Calais. The coastal defenses were manned primarily by static infantry divisions, many composed of older soldiers, those recovering from wounds on the Eastern Front, or Osttruppen, Eastern European volunteers or conscripts of questionable reliability. But inland from the beaches, positioned to counterattack any Allied penetration, were more capable forces. The 91st Luftlande Infantry Division, to which Obergefreiter Hartmann belonged, was one of these units. Designated as an air landing division, meaning it was trained to be transported by aircraft, though it rarely actually flew, the 91st had been formed in January of 1944 specifically for the defense of the Cotentin Peninsula. Its soldiers were younger than those in the coastal static divisions, better trained, more motivated. The division included about 8,500 men organized into two regiments, the 1057th and 1058th Grenadier Regiments, supported by artillery and anti-tank units. The 91st's mission was clear. If the Allies landed on the Cotentin Peninsula, the division would counterattack and drive them back into the sea before they could establish a lodgment. The division's positions were concentrated around the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, a small Norman village that sat astride the main north-south road, the N13, connecting the port of Cherbourg to the south. Whoever controlled Sainte-Mère-Église controlled movement through the peninsula. German officers understood this. So did the American planners assigning drop zones to the 82nd Airborne. The plan for Operation Neptune, the airborne component of the D-Day invasion, called for the 82nd to drop in two areas. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment would land directly around Sainte-Mère-Église, with orders to seize and hold the town. The 507th and 508th Regiments would land further west, near the Meurthe River, with missions to secure bridges and causeways that crossed the marshy ground. These water crossings were vital. Without them, American forces landing on Utah Beach would be bottlenecked on the narrow beach exits, vulnerable to German counterattack. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, veterans of Sicily and Italy, would not jump on D-Day. They would land by sea in follow-up waves, providing reinforcement once the initial objectives were secured. This meant the 82nd would go into Normandy with roughly 9,000 men. 3 parachute infantry regiments plus supporting units, against a German force that included not only the 91st Division but also elements of the 243rd Infantry Division, the 709th Infantry Division on the coast, and various smaller formations scattered across the peninsula. The American paratroopers received their final briefings on June 4th and 5th. They studied sand tables showing the Norman terrain, memorized photographs of their objectives, reviewed rally points and recognition signals. Each man received a small metal cricket, a toy-like clicker that made a distinctive snap when pressed. One click would be answered with 2 clicks, identifying friend from foe in the darkness. They blackened their faces with burnt cork or charcoal. They checked and rechecked their equipment, adjusted straps, secured loose items. Many wrote final letters home, to be delivered if they did not return. In the early evening of June 5th, after a 24-hour weather delay, the paratroopers loaded onto C-47 transport aircraft at airfields across southern England. Each plane carried 18 men, a stick in airborne terminology. The men sat on canvas bench seats running along both sides of the fuselage, equipment piled on their laps and between their legs, parachute static lines coiled and ready. The planes took off in the fading daylight, forming massive formations that stretched across miles of sky. 921 C-47s and gliders carried the American airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, toward France that night. Hartmann, sleeping in a bunker outside Sainte-Mère-Église, heard them coming around 1 o'clock in the morning on June 6th. The sound started as a distant hum, then grew into a roar that seemed to fill the sky. Searchlights stabbed upward, tracking the formations. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, bright streams of tracer rounds arcing into the darkness. The guns were too few, too scattered. The formations kept coming. The C-47s carrying the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment approached Sainte-Mère-Église from the northeast, flying at approximately 1,500 feet altitude, slower than normal to compensate for the heavy loads the paratroopers carried. As the planes crossed the Normandy coast, German anti-aircraft fire intensified. Tracers punched through aluminum fuselages. Planes shuddered and broke formation. Inside the aircraft, the paratroopers stood, hooked their static lines to the anchor cable running along the ceiling, and shuffled toward the open doors. The green light flashed. They jumped. What happened next would become one of the most studied events in airborne history. The combination of German anti-aircraft fire, evasive maneuvering by pilots, and navigation errors in the darkness caused the 505th Regiment to scatter across a drop zone that stretched nearly 25 miles. Instead of landing in tight concentrations around their objectives, paratroopers came down in fields, marshes, forests, and, in some terrible cases, directly into German positions or into the town square of Sainte-Mère-Église itself, where a building fire had brought townspeople and German soldiers into the streets. But the scattering, paradoxically, may have saved the operation. German defenders who had prepared to meet concentrated American forces instead found themselves confronting small groups of paratroopers appearing from every direction. The 91st Division's carefully planned defensive positions suddenly faced threats from their flanks, their rear, their supply routes. Confusion spread through the German command structure. How many Americans had landed? Where were they concentrating? What were their objectives? The paratroopers themselves faced immediate and desperate challenges. Many landed miles from their assigned drop zones, alone or in groups of 2 or 3, with no clear idea where they were or where their units might be. Their training took over. They used their crickets to find other Americans in the darkness. They moved toward the sound of shooting. They attacked whatever Germans they encountered. Small groups coalesced into larger groups, sergeants and lieutenants assuming command of whoever they found, regardless of unit assignment. A man from Company A of the 505th might find himself fighting alongside soldiers from Company E of the 508th and Company C of the 507th. It did not matter. They were all 82nd, and they all had missions to accomplish. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 505th, landed with a small group near his intended drop zone, northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église. Gathering approximately 40 men from various companies, Krause led them directly toward the town. They moved through the darkness using ditches and hedgerows for cover, killing or capturing German sentries they encountered. By 4:30 in the morning, less than 3.5 hours after jumping, Krause's improvised force entered Sainte-Mère-Église from the west. The Germans defending the town were from the 3rd Battalion of the 1058th Grenadier Regiment, a force of perhaps 200 men. They had spent the night dealing with paratroopers who had landed in the town square and on surrounding rooftops, shooting some while they dangled helplessly from their parachutes caught on buildings and trees. But they had not expected an organized assault from outside the town. Krause's men hit them with grenades and rifle fire, pushing through the streets in the darkness. By dawn, the Americans controlled Sainte-Mère-Église. Krause raised an American flag, which he had carried specifically for this purpose, from the town hall. The first French town was liberated. Hartmann learned of Sainte-Mère-Église's fall at sunrise, when a breathless runner reached his company's position 2 kilometers to the southwest. The news made no sense. How could a town defended by a German battalion fall to scattered paratroopers in a few hours? His company commander, Hauptmann Georg Merten, immediately ordered a counterattack to retake the town. This was doctrine. This was what they had trained for. Counterattack quickly, before the Americans could consolidate. The counterattack failed. As Hartmann's company advanced toward Sainte-Mère-Église through the hedgerows and fields, they encountered American paratroopers who seemed to be everywhere, not in large formations that could be outmaneuvered, but in small groups positioned in hedgerows, behind walls, in farm buildings. The Americans did not retreat when the Germans advanced. They fired with precision. They maneuvered to flanking positions. They used their M1 rifles with devastating effectiveness. The M1 Garand, with its 8-round en-bloc clip and semi-automatic fire, allowed American riflemen to put out twice the volume of fire of a German soldier with his bolt-action Kar 98K. In a hedgerow fight, where engagements happened at ranges of 50 to 100 meters, that advantage was decisive. Hartmann's company took casualties and fell back. A second counterattack that afternoon, this time with tank support, 2 French-made Renault R-35s captured in 1940 also failed. The American paratroopers destroyed 1 tank with a bazooka and disabled the second. The infantry support melted away under accurate rifle and machine gun fire. Merten pulled his remaining men back to defensive positions and sent a request for reinforcement to regiment headquarters. This pattern repeated across the 82nd's area of operations during the first 2 days of the invasion. German units attempting to move toward Utah Beach to counterattack the seaborne landings found their routes blocked or interdicted by American paratroopers. The 795th Georgian Battalion, Osttruppen, who had surrendered to the Soviets and been recruited by the Germans, attempted to cross the La Fière Causeway over the Murderet River on the morning of June 6th. They ran into elements of the 505th and 507th Regiments, who had taken positions covering the causeway. The fighting was savage and close. The Americans held. The Georgians, already of questionable loyalty, broke and scattered. At the Merderet River crossings, La Fière, Chef du Pont, American paratroopers established defensive positions and held them against repeated German attempts to dislodge them. The ground around the Merderet was marshy, flooded in places where the Germans had deliberately broken levees as a defensive measure. This meant the causeways, narrow raised roads crossing the wet ground, were the only practical routes for vehicles. Control of these causeways was essential, and the 82nd's paratroopers understood this. They dug in and prepared to hold regardless of cost. The battle for La Fière Causeway would become legendary within the division. On June 6th, approximately 200 men from various companies of the 505th and 507th Regiments held the western end of the causeway against elements of the 1027th Grenadier Regiment. The Germans attacked repeatedly, trying to break through and reach the beach. Each attack was thrown back. American casualties mounted. The paratroopers had limited ammunition, no artillery support, and faced an enemy with numerical superiority and better positions on the high ground across the river. But they held. On June 9th, after 3 days of defensive fighting, the 82nd received orders to attack across the La Fière Causeway and seize the high ground on the western side. This meant assaulting across a narrow causeway, approximately 500 meters long, completely exposed, against entrenched German positions with clear fields of fire. It was a tactical nightmare. But orders were orders, and the division attacked. The assault began at 10:45 in the morning. Paratroopers from the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, which had landed by glider on June 7th, advanced down the causeway in 2 columns, one on each side of the road. German machine guns and mortars opened fire immediately. Men fell. The columns kept moving. They crossed the causeway under fire, took casualties that would have broken most units, and assaulted the German positions on the far side. By mid-afternoon, the 82nd controlled the western side of the Murderet River. The cost was approximately 50% casualties among the attacking companies. The Germans defending the position, the 3rd Battalion of the 1057th Grenadier Regiment, essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. This was what Hartmann meant when he called the American paratroopers devils. This was what German commanders reported up their chain of command with increasing urgency in the days following the invasion. These Americans did not behave like the soft, wealthy conscripts Berlin's propaganda had described. They attacked when outnumbered. They held positions against superior forces. They adapted to circumstances, fighting independently when cut off from command, improvising solutions to tactical problems, pressing attacks even when taking heavy casualties. The baggy jumpsuits became, in German eyes, distinctive markers of an elite enemy force. When German soldiers saw those silhouettes moving through the hedgerows, they knew they faced the 82nd. The nickname, Teufel in weiten Hosen, Devils in Baggy Pants, began appearing in German unit reports and letters home within days of the invasion. It was not an official designation, not something handed down from Wehrmacht High Command. It arose organically from the soldiers who faced the 82nd in combat, a recognition of capability that transcended national propaganda. By June 12th, 6 days after the invasion, the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division had been reduced to approximately 20% of its original strength. The division's 2 grenadier regiments were shattered. Most of its officers were dead or captured. The survivors were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, trying to avoid American patrols while retreating toward Cherbourg. The 82nd Airborne, meanwhile, was consolidating its positions, preparing for the advance westward to cut off the peninsula and capture the vital port. Hartmann survived. On June 14th, his squad was captured by a patrol from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment while attempting to move through a gap in the American lines. The Americans took them to a prisoner collection point behind Utah Beach, where Hartmann saw for the first time the full scale of the Allied invasion. The beach was packed with supplies, vehicles, equipment, men. Ships stretched to the horizon. LSTs, landing ship tank, ran directly onto the sand, dropped their ramps, and disgorged trucks and tanks and artillery pieces. Cranes unloaded cargo from larger vessels onto smaller landing craft. Bulldozers carved roads through the dunes. The Americans were building an entire logistics system on an open beach in full view of German artillery observation posts that should have been destroying them. But the artillery never came. The Luftwaffe never appeared. The great German counterattack Berlin kept promising never materialized. Hartmann spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in England, then in the United States. He returned to Germany in 1946, to a country that no longer existed in any form he recognized. He lived quietly, worked as a carpenter, rarely spoke about the war. But in 1973, interviewed by an American historian researching the Normandy campaign, he was asked about his experience facing the 82nd Airborne. His answer was simple. They were devils, he said, not because they were cruel or inhumane, They were devils because they would not stop. You could not make them stop. You could kill them, and the others would keep coming. You could surround them, and they would attack out of the encirclement. We had been told Americans were soft, that they would break if pressed hard. But these men in the baggy suits, they were the ones who pressed. They were the ones who broke us. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation in German perception of the 82nd Airborne did not happen uniformly or immediately across all Wehrmacht units. But within the 91st Division and the other formations that fought the paratroopers in Normandy, the recognition spread quickly. After-action reports filed by surviving German officers in mid-June consistently noted the aggressiveness and capability of the American airborne forces. These reports, captured after the war and now held in various archives, provide direct evidence of the psychological impact the 82nd had on its opponents. One such report, filed by Major Friedrich von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Parachute Regiment that fought against American airborne forces near Carentan, described the 82nd's soldiers as possessing an extraordinary high level of individual training, and noted that they fought with considerable tenacity and showed themselves to be brave opponents. Von der Heydte, himself a Fallschirmjäger officer with combat experience spanning from Crete to the Eastern Front, was not given to exaggeration or compliments. His assessment carried weight precisely because he understood what elite airborne forces looked like, and he recognized those qualities in his American opponents. The nickname Devils in Baggy Pants itself has a somewhat murky origin. Unlike some military nicknames that can be traced to specific documents or moments, this one appears to have emerged from multiple sources simultaneously. The earliest documented reference appears in a captured diary of an officer from the 1058th Grenadier Regiment, dated June 10, 1944. The entry describes an engagement near Sainte-Mère-Église and refers to the American paratroopers as those devils in their loose jumpsuits. Similar phrases appear in letters written by German soldiers in mid-June, before they were killed or captured, letters that were found on their bodies and translated by American intelligence officers. What seems clear is that the baggy M1942 jumpsuit became, for German soldiers, a distinctive visual marker that signaled a particular kind of American unit. Wehrmacht training emphasized the importance of identifying enemy units quickly. Different Allied formations had different capabilities, and knowing whether you faced British commandos or American infantry or Canadian tank units could inform tactical decisions. The jumpsuits made the 82nd instantly recognizable, and the recognition carried implications. These were not ordinary infantry. These were airborne, elite, aggressive, dangerous. The psychological dimension of this recognition deserves examination. The Wehrmacht in June of 1944 was still a formidable fighting force. German soldiers had years of combat experience, superior tactical doctrine in many areas, and a military culture that emphasized aggression and initiative. They were not easily impressed. For these soldiers to grant a distinctive nickname to an enemy unit indicated something significant about that unit's performance on the battlefield. Part of what impressed German soldiers was the 82nd's evident willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. This was not recklessness or poor tactical sense. The paratroopers used cover, maneuvered intelligently, and avoided pointless losses. But when pressed, when given a mission that required frontal assault or holding an exposed position, they did it without hesitation. The assault across La Fière Causeway exemplified this. Any competent soldier looking at that causeway would recognize the attack as near suicidal. The paratroopers attacked anyway, and succeeded. German military doctrine placed high value on this quality, the willingness to attack despite the odds, to hold despite losses. The Wehrmacht's own elite formations exhibited these characteristics. The SS Panzer divisions, the Fallschirmjäger, the Großdeutschland division. These units built their reputations on exactly this kind of determined combat performance. For German soldiers to recognize similar qualities in an American unit represented a significant revision of their preconceptions about American fighting capability. The adaptation and improvisation displayed by the 82nd's paratroopers also earned German respect. When the drop scattered the division across 25 miles of Norman countryside, breaking up carefully planned organizational structures and leaving men separated from their equipment and leaders, the paratroopers responded by forming ad hoc units and accomplishing missions anyway. This kind of decentralized initiative was exactly what German tactical doctrine prescribed, and exactly what Wehrmacht propaganda claimed Americans lacked. Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment exemplified this adaptive quality. Landing far from his intended drop zone on the night of June 6th, Funk gathered approximately 15 men from various companies, none of whom he had trained with, and led them in a series of attacks on German positions over the next 3 days. His improvised squad destroyed 2 German machine gun nests, captured 17 prisoners, and severed a telephone line that had been coordinating German defensive fire against Utah Beach. Funk would later receive the Medal of Honor for actions in Belgium, but his performance in Normandy demonstrated the kind of individual initiative that characterized the entire division. The technological advantage the Americans enjoyed also contributed to German perceptions, though in more subtle ways than simple firepower superiority. The M1 Garand rifle, with its semi-automatic fire, an 8-round capacity, gave American paratroopers a significant edge in the close-range firefights that dominated hedgerow combat. But equally important was the M1 carbine, a lightweight semi-automatic weapon issued to officers, NCOs, and support troops. In a normal infantry division, officers typically carried pistols or submachine guns. In the 82nd, many officers and senior sergeants carried carbines, which gave them the ability to engage effectively at ranges up to 200 meters while still being light enough for airborne operations. The Americans also had the bazooka, the M1A1 rocket launcher, in numbers that surprised German defenders. Each parachute infantry company in the 82nd had multiple bazooka teams, and the weapon proved devastatingly effective against German armor and fortified positions. The bazooka gave ordinary infantrymen the ability to destroy tanks, something German infantry could only accomplish with close assault tactics using magnetic mines or Panzerfaust rockets at extremely short range. The psychological effect of watching a tank, the supreme weapon of armored warfare, get destroyed by 2 soldiers with a tube launcher was considerable. But technology alone does not explain the German reaction. The Red Army had massive numbers of tanks, artillery, and soldiers, and while German forces certainly respected Soviet military power, they did not grant Soviet units nicknames, suggesting supernatural qualities. The Devil's nickname reflected something beyond material superiority. It reflected a recognition of individual soldier quality that German military culture valued highly. This recognition created tactical problems for German commanders in Normandy. Standard doctrine for dealing with enemy penetrations involved identifying the penetration, containing it, then counterattacking with mobile reserves to eliminate the threat. This doctrine had worked effectively on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, but it failed against the 82nd because the paratroopers did not behave like normal penetrations. They did not wait to be contained. They expanded their positions aggressively, attacked German assembly areas before counterattacks could be organized, and held key terrain that German doctrine said should be indefensible without heavy weapon support. The battle for Hill 30, north of Sainte-Mère-Église, illustrated this tactical frustration. On June 7th, approximately 150 paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion of the 505th Regiment occupied this modest hill that overlooked the N13 highway and the surrounding countryside. The position was exposed, could be fired on from 3 sides, and lacked any significant fortifications. German tactical doctrine said such a position should be evacuated or reinforced with artillery and heavy weapons. The paratroopers had neither artillery nor heavy weapons. They held anyway. Over the next 3 days, elements of the 1058th Grenadier Regiment attempted repeatedly to retake Hill 30. They attacked with infantry supported by mortars. They maneuvered to cut the position off from American lines. They brought up assault guns to provide direct fire support. The paratroopers held. They used every bit of cover, dug shallow fighting positions despite the rocky soil, rationed their ammunition carefully, and made every German attack costly enough that the next attack took longer to organize. By June 10th, when the hill was finally relieved by advancing American forces from Utah Beach, the defenders had repelled 5 separate German assaults and inflicted casualties estimated at 3-1 against the attackers. From the German perspective, this kind of defensive success without artillery or armor support seemed almost impossible. German units in similar situations would call for artillery fire, would receive it, and would use it to break up enemy attacks. The Americans on Hill 30 had no artillery to call on. The division's artillery was still being assembled after the scattered drop, yet they held anyway through superior marksmanship, aggressive patrolling, and a defensive mindset that emphasized counterattacking into German assault formations rather than passively defending. This aggressive defensive philosophy, deeply embedded in Ridgway's training regimen, confused German tactical planning. German officers attempting to predict American reactions found their predictions consistently wrong. Surrounded units were supposed to surrender or attempt breakout. The 82nd's surrounded units attacked. Outnumbered forces were supposed to withdraw to better defensive terrain. The 82nd's outnumbered forces held their ground and called for reinforcement. Units taking significant casualties were supposed to lose combat effectiveness. The 82nd's units maintained their fighting capability down to surprisingly low strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 505th Regiment, exemplified the leadership style that produced these results. Vandervoort broke his ankle during the jump on June 6th, but refused evacuation, instead commanding his battalion from a makeshift stretcher or being carried by his soldiers when necessary to move. His battalion fought continuously from June 6th through June 15th, participating in the seizure of Sainte-Mère-Église, the defense of Hill 30, and multiple attacks to expand the American perimeter. Vandervoort's physical presence despite his injury set a standard his men followed. If the battalion commander would not quit despite a broken ankle, how could any soldier quit for lesser reasons? This leadership philosophy permeated the division from Ridgway down through regimental and battalion commanders to company officers and squad leaders. The 82nd's casualty rates among officers and NCOs were higher than normal infantry divisions because these leaders led from the front, exposed themselves to enemy fire, and personally participated in assaults rather than directing them from rear positions. The Germans noticed this. Captured German soldiers, when interrogated, frequently mentioned that American officers seemed to be everywhere, always visible, always pushing their men forward. The German military culture respected this kind of leadership. The Wehrmacht's own tactical doctrine emphasized Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders that gave subordinate commanders significant freedom to accomplish objectives as they saw fit, with the expectation that leaders would be forward, making decisions based on immediate battlefield conditions. The 82nd's leadership style matched these principles, and German soldiers recognized professional competence when they saw it, regardless of nationality. By mid-June, as the 82nd Airborne prepared to advance westward toward Cherbourg, the division's reputation among German forces in Normandy was firmly established. The 91st Luftlande Infantry Division had been effectively destroyed as a combat unit. The 243rd Infantry Division, which had also fought against the paratroopers, was reduced to approximately 40% strength. German units receiving orders to move through the 82nd's area of operations did so cautiously, knowing they faced an opponent who would fight aggressively for every hedgerow and farmhouse. The advance toward Cherbourg revealed another dimension of the 82nd's capability: sustained offensive operations over extended periods. Airborne divisions were theoretically designed for short-duration missions: jump in, seize objectives, hold until relieved by conventional ground forces. The 82nd in Normandy fought continuously for 33 days, conducting offensive operations, defensive stands, and attacks against fortified positions, all while operating as regular infantry without the heavy equipment normal infantry divisions possessed. The town of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte fell to the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment on June 16th. After a day-long battle, the town sat on the Douve River and controlled a critical bridge. German defenders from the 77th Infantry Division attempted to hold it, fortifying buildings and preparing demolitions on the bridge. The 505th attacked frontally, cleared the town building by building, and captured the bridge intact. The fighting was brutal and close. Grenades thrown through windows, rifle fire at ranges measured in meters, hand-to-hand combat in several locations. By nightfall, the town was American, the bridge was secured, and the 77th Division's survivors were retreating northward. This pattern continued as the 82nd drove north. The division did not have tanks, relied on minimal artillery support, and fought primarily as light infantry. Yet they maintained offensive momentum against German forces that included elements of multiple divisions, fortified towns, and terrain that heavily favored the defender. The hedgerows of Normandy, ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, dividing fields into small enclosed parcels, should have neutralized the American advantages in firepower and mobility. Instead, the 82nd adapted, learning to use the hedgerows for concealment while developing tactics to assault through them. These tactics involved careful coordination between rifle squads, machine gun teams, and bazooka crews. A typical assault on a hedgerow position began with suppressive fire from M1919 Browning machine guns, forcing German defenders to keep their heads down. While the machine guns fired, a rifle squad would maneuver along the base of an adjacent hedgerow, moving to a flanking position. Bazooka teams would fire at any identified German machine gun positions, the rockets having enough explosive power to penetrate the hedgerow banks. Once the rifle squad reached its flanking position, it would assault through the hedgerow with grenades and rifle fire while the machine guns shifted their fire to support the assault. The entire sequence required precise timing, clear communication, and soldiers willing to advance under fire. The 82nd developed these skills through repeated practice, learning from each engagement and adapting tactics based on what worked. German defenders attempting to hold hedgerow positions against these tactics found themselves consistently outmaneuvered. The Americans seemed to appear from unexpected directions, to coordinate their attacks with a level of sophistication that suggested extensive training, and to maintain pressure even when taking casualties. Defense in depth. The normal German response to enemy attacks proved less effective because American paratroopers would bypass strong points, attack them from the flanks or rear, and maintain forward momentum rather than stopping to reduce every defended position. By June 26th, When the 82nd Airborne was finally pulled off the line and sent to rest areas in England, the division had accomplished every mission assigned to it. Sainte-Mère-Église remained in American hands throughout the campaign. The Merderet River crossings were secured. The advance to Cherbourg had cut the Cotentin Peninsula, trapping German forces in the port city. The division's casualties were significant. Approximately 46%, with over 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing from the original jump force of approximately 9,000. But the missions were accomplished, the objectives seized, the enemy beaten. The cost to the German forces that opposed them was higher. The 91st Luftland Infantry Division ceased to exist. The 243rd Infantry Division was rebuilt 3 times during the war, each time after being destroyed in combat, the first time being Normandy. The 1058th Grenadier Regiment's survivors were folded into other units. The 1057th Grenadier Regiment was similarly disbanded. The smaller formations, the Georgian battalions, the fortress troops, the static divisions, were largely eliminated as fighting forces during the first 2 weeks of the campaign. The nickname Devils in Baggy Pants survived the war, carried forward in the memoirs and histories written by German veterans. Von der Heydte, who survived the war and became a prominent military theorist in the Federal Republic of Germany, wrote extensively about his experiences fighting Allied airborne forces. In his assessments, he consistently identified the American paratroopers as among the most capable opponents he faced during the entire war. His praise was specific and professional. He noted their training, their aggressive tactics, their ability to operate independently, their resilience under pressure. Other German veterans were less analytical but no less clear in their assessments. In interviews conducted during the 1960s and 70s for various historical projects, former Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought in Normandy frequently mentioned the 82nd when asked about particularly difficult opponents. The baggy jumpsuits appear repeatedly in these accounts, almost as shorthand for a specific type of American soldier: elite, aggressive, dangerous. The nickname also entered American military culture, though from the opposite direction. The 82nd adopted it proudly, recognizing that earning such a designation from German opponents represented validation of their capabilities. The division's official histories mention the nickname. Unit newsletters reference it. Veterans embrace it as recognition of their service. In this way, a phrase born from German respect became part of American airborne identity. The broader significance of the 82nd's performance in Normandy extends beyond nicknames or unit reputation. The division's success demonstrated that American ground forces, properly trained and led, could match or exceed German forces in tactical capability. This was not obvious in 1944. The Wehrmacht had dominated European battlefields for 5 years, demonstrating tactical sophistication and combat effectiveness that made them the standard by which other armies were measured. The question of whether American soldiers could fight effectively against German troops, not simply overwhelm them with superior numbers and equipment, but actually outfight them tactically, was genuinely open in the spring of 1944. The 82nd answered that question definitively. In the hedgerows of Normandy, American paratroopers proved they could seize objectives against opposition, hold ground against counterattacks, adapt to fluid tactical situations, maintain offensive momentum, and do all of this while operating under conditions that negated most American material advantages. They fought, in many cases, with equipment parity or even inferiority. The Germans had more machine guns per battalion, better grenades, and more effective infantry anti-tank weapons. The Americans won through superior training, aggressive leadership, and a tactical philosophy that emphasized seizing and maintaining initiative. This success influenced American military thinking for the remainder of the war and beyond. The airborne divisions proved that elite, intensively trained units could accomplish objectives that ordinary formations could not. This validation led to the expansion of airborne forces, the development of new airborne operations. Market Garden. In September 1944, varsity in March 1945, and eventually to the modern American Special Operations community that traces its lineage directly back to the U-Boot airborne divisions. For the Germans, the lesson was more bitter. The nickname Devils in Baggy Pants represented an acknowledgement that American soldiers, when properly prepared and led, were every bit as capable as German troops. This recognition contradicted fundamental assumptions of Nazi racial ideology and German military cultural superiority. If Americans could produce elite soldiers who fought with the aggression, skill, and determination the Wehrmacht prided itself on, then German victory was not inevitable based on soldier quality. Victory would depend on resources, industrial capacity, strategic position, all areas where Germany was increasingly overmatched. The psychological impact of this recognition should not be underestimated. German soldiers in Normandy were, for the first time in the war, facing Western Allied forces that matched them tactically while possessing overwhelming material superiority. On the Eastern Front, German forces often maintained tactical superiority even when outnumbered and outgunned by Soviet forces. In Normandy, they faced opponents who were tactically competent and materially superior. The implications were clear to any soldier with sense. Germany was going to lose this war. Hartmann, the Obergefreiter whose experience opened this account, understood this by the time he became a prisoner on June 14th. Sitting in the POW cage behind Utah Beach, watching the endless stream of American supplies flowing ashore, he realized that the propaganda about American weakness had been a lie from the beginning. The men in the baggy pants who had shattered his division were not soft or inexperienced or dependent on material advantages. They were simply good soldiers, well-trained and aggressively led, backed by an industrial system that could provide them with everything they needed to fight. In his 1973 interview, Hartmann was asked whether he bore any resentment toward the American paratroopers who had defeated his unit. He shook his head. "No resentment," he said. "They were soldiers doing their jobs, just as we were. Good soldiers. Perhaps better soldiers than us in the end. They earned their nickname. We Germans, we understood what it meant to be elite, to be special troops. The Fallschirmjäger, the SS divisions, we knew what made a unit elite. The Americans in the baggy pants, they had those qualities. We recognized it because we had lived it ourselves. That is why we called them devils. Not as an insult, but as respect, I suppose. A soldier's respect for another soldier who will not quit, who will not break, who comes at you again and again no matter what you do to stop him. That is what a devil is in war. Someone who will not stop coming." The irony, Hartmann noted, was that the Americans probably did not realize how significant that recognition was. From the German perspective, granting such a nickname to an enemy unit represented admission that the unit had achieved a level of capability that demanded respect. The Americans seemed to think it was just propaganda, something said to make them feel important. But the German soldiers meant it sincerely. The men in the baggy pants were devils because they fought like devils. And fighting like devils was the highest compliment a German soldier could offer to an enemy. The 82nd Airborne went on to fight in Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, dropped into Holland to seize bridges across the Rhine River system. They fought in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December, holding the town of Werbelmont against German attacks. They advanced into Germany in 1945, participated in the occupation, and eventually returned home as one of the most decorated divisions in the American military.
The baggy M1942 jumpsuits were eventually replaced by more modern equipment, but the nickname remained. Devils in Baggy Pants became part of the division's identity. Printed on unit patches, referenced in official histories, taught to new soldiers joining the unit. For the Germans who fought in Normandy, the memory remained vivid decades after the war ended. In veterans' gatherings, in interviews, in the quiet moments when old soldiers spoke honestly about their experiences, the 82nd came up repeatedly. Not with bitterness or resentment, but with a certain wary respect. These were the Americans who had beaten them not through numbers or equipment, but through skill and aggression and determination. These were the soldiers who had proved that American troops, when tested, could fight. The ultimate historical irony is that the nickname meant to describe American paratroopers, devils in baggy pants, actually reveals more about the Germans who used it than about the Americans it described. It reveals that German soldiers, despite years of indoctrination about racial superiority and military supremacy, could still recognize professional competence when they encountered it. It reveals that the Wehrmacht's tactical culture, which emphasized aggression and initiative, could appreciate those same qualities in an opponent. And it reveals that the Nazi ideology's claims about American weakness were lies. Lies that German soldiers discovered the hard way in the hedgerows of Normandy. The men of the 82nd Airborne did not set out to earn a nickname from their enemies. They set out to accomplish missions, to seize objectives, to win battles. The nickname came as a byproduct of how they accomplished those missions, with aggression, skill, and a refusal to accept defeat. That the Germans chose to call them devils says less about American demonic qualities and more about German recognition that they faced an elite opponent worthy of respect. In the end, that may be the most important lesson from this story. War strips away propaganda and ideology, leaving only the brutal reality of what soldiers can accomplish on the battlefield. In Normandy, that reality was clear. The Americans in the baggy pants were elite soldiers who fought with determination and skill. The Germans recognized it, granted them a nickname that acknowledged it, and carried that recognition forward for the rest of their lives. The devils were real, but they were human devils. Men who trained hard, fought well, and proved that American soldiers could match any opponent in the world when given proper preparation and leadership. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.